Scrum is probably the most popular agile framework being used by teams today. Its popularity likely rests on the fact that it is a simple set of constraints that, when combined, provide an easy-to-understand yet effective framework for any team building or sustaining a complex product or service. Now, first, a small disclaimer. While the Scrum framework can be easily explained, and we'll get to that in a second, it is important to keep in mind that Scrum is not the answer to all the problems that frequently plague delivery teams. Yes, some of the changes Scrum requires can provide almost immediate benefits in most cases. Short feedback loops, dedicated teams, incremental delivery approach, clear priorities, transparent agreements. Which team couldn't derive some benefit from that? But more important than the Scrum framework are the principles and values that underpin it. Many successful teams have used Scrum as a starting point to fundamentally change how they look at work. They changed much more than their processes. They changed their culture. Scrum is a good starting point for teams and organizations as they start to change their perspective on the world of work. Being successful with Scrum depends on creating a work culture that values transparency, continuous improvement of both the product and the delivery processes, incremental product development, collaboration, and self-organization. Scrum won't magically give you all that. It's not something you just implement, but it should set your team off in the right direction by providing a basic agile structure with clear rules from where you can start continuously improving. So that's the disclaimer. Now, without further ado, let's take a look at the Scrum framework. For whatever product or service you're building, you will always have a group of stakeholders that are interested or impacted by your activities. These could be external stakeholders, such as end users, customers, suppliers, partners, or the government. They could also be internal stakeholders in your organization, such as the legal department or marketing department, with whom maybe you need to align on release dates, or maybe even some other delivery teams in the organization. Scrum defines one role who, among other things, is going to be responsible for co-creating, communicating, and aligning with stakeholders on the vision and objectives for the specific product, updating stakeholders on the progress of product development and aligning with them on necessary decisions, and also aligning with stakeholders on the upcoming priorities that need to be worked on. Scrum calls this role the product owner. Now, beyond stakeholder management, the product owner will also be responsible for maximizing the return on investment for the specific product or service. It doesn't matter if the bag of money is hers to begin with, or whether she's receiving it via some stakeholder. The product owner is always going to be responsible for deciding on how to spend that money with the objective of maximizing return on investment. In order to assist her in this endeavor, Scrum will give the product owner a key artifact, the product backlog, which is essentially a container for all the things that need to be built or changed for the product in question. The product backlog has some key characteristics. It is an ordered list, making it clear to everybody involved in the development of the product or service what is the next thing that should be done. So Scrum teams will typically talk about the prioritization of the product backlog, and it is the product owner who is responsible for defining these priorities. Another characteristic of a backlog is that higher priority items, those that will be worked on first, are smaller and more refined. Backlog items with lower priority tend to be more high level, along the lines of, hey, we should work on this idea in 2 and 3 months. We'll figure out the details if or when it becomes important. Also, the items in the product backlog should deliver some value to the stakeholders, ideally the end user or customer. When it comes to how to call the items on this product backlog, Scrum shuns creativity or fancy marketing names and simply calls them product backlog items. So when you hear people referring to a PBI, that's what they mean. There are many types of PBIs, such as new product capabilities, improvement actions, technical improvements, or maintenance requests. Regardless of the type, a PBI must deliver some clear value. The second role in Scrum is a development team. At a high level, the product owner is going to focus on answering what questions. What is the next problem we have to solve? What is the next piece of value we need to focus on? What characteristics does it have? The development team, on the other hand, will focus on how questions. How are we going to solve this problem? How can we deliver this capability to our end users? How do we implement this? A Scrum development team has some key characteristics. It's a small team, somewhere between 3 to 9 people. It's a cross-functional team. This doesn't mean everybody can do everything, though that would be nice, but it does mean all the skills needed to deliver value are present in the team. Also, it's a self-organizing team. They have to respect the constraints of Scrum, but within those constraints, they self-organize in their efforts to improve so they can deliver as much value as possible. The container for everything that happens in Scrum is called a sprint. The sprint is a time box of less than a month. A Scrum team is always in a sprint. When one sprint finishes, another one begins. the time box of the sprint cannot be extended. Otherwise, it's not really a time box, is it? A sprint is a complete feedback loop where the team goes through a mini project in a few days. They pull in some work, figure out an approach, self-organize to deliver, get some feedback on their deliverable, and finally, they figure out how to improve. The shorter your sprint, the shorter your feedback loop, the faster you learn about your real progress. Are you on the right track? Are you delivering at a fast enough rate? If not, what do you do about it? Can we improve as a team? Is there waste we can remove? What about quality standards we can improve? Most teams doing Scrum nowadays are using sprints of 2 weeks or less for this reason. They want to accelerate their learning and improvement to ultimately deliver more value. The sprint is structured via a series of events. How does a sprint kick off? The development team will pull from the top of the backlog the PBIs they believe they can deliver in the next sprint. That word pull is important, as it is the development team who decides how much work they believe they are capable of doing in the next sprint, not the product owner. You know how it goes. Product owners have a tendency to think things are a bit easier than they actually are. In exchange, the development team needs to respect the priorities set by the product owner. They don't just work on any PBI, they work on the next highest priority PBIs. This conversation about what PBIs the development team will work on in the current sprint happens during an event called the sprint planning, where the development team and product owner agree on a plan for the sprint. The sprint planning will basically have two parts. The what part, where the development team and product owner discuss the PBIs they are pulling into the sprint and see if it is clear what is the problem they are solving with this PBI and if there are any big questions still open. The second part is the how part, where the development team gets together and identifies all the tasks that they have to do in order to deliver each PBI. This is the part of the sprint planning where the development team creates their initial plan of the work they need to do during the sprint. This discussion can get quite technical and might be boring for the product owner, but the product owner shouldn't leave the room, as questions might come up. Better to be close by. If she gets bored, it's a great time to do some of that other work, like emails or those pesky TPS reports. The result of this planning exercise, the combination of the PBIs the development team is forecasting they can deliver, plus the task breakdown of the work they have to do to deliver them, is what Scrum refers to as the sprint backlog, and it is the output of the sprint planning event. Most Scrum teams will visualize their sprint backlog in a visual task board, as it helps the team self-organize, focus, and collaborate during the sprint. During the sprint planning, the product owner and development team can also craft a sprint goal, a unifying objective they are trying to accomplish during the sprint. Some teams find that a sprint goal helps keep them focused. After the development team created their sprint backlog, the sprint planning is over and they get to work. Every day, Scrum is going to ask the development team to get together and inspect and adapt their sprint backlog in an event called the Daily Scrum, which is time-boxed to 15 minutes. During this event, the development team quickly align on a variety of relevant topics. How are they progressing? Still on track? Is the plan, i.e. their sprint backlog, still okay, or does it need to be adapted? Does everybody know what they're doing next? Does anybody need help? Do we have any impediments blocking us that have not yet been escalated or picked up? Basically, Scrum is empowering the development team to self-organize during the sprint to deliver as much value as possible, and it just wants to make sure the team gets together at least once a day to align on how things are going. Most teams will do this in the morning. Some teams prefer to close the day with it. Typically, the product owner will also be present during the daily Scrum, but will not take a leading role in it, as it is an event led by the development team. During the sprint, the product owner and the development team will also take some time to perform the activity of backlog refinement. The product backlog represents the current understanding of the next things the team should work on. It should be continuously refined to make sure it takes into account the latest developments, learnings, and issues that have emerged. This maintenance of the product backlog happens during the backlog refinement activity. Unlike other Scrum events, backlog refinement is an activity because it doesn't happen at a specific moment during the sprint. It can happen at any time. The informal chat the product owner had with a stakeholder over coffee to discuss the priority of one of the PBIs? That's backlog refinement. The recurring weekly meeting the product owner has with the key stakeholders to validate upcoming priorities? That's backlog refinement. The meetings with the development team to estimate the upcoming PBIs? You guessed it, that's backlog refinement. Scrum is just highlighting that this activity needs to happen and is typically led by the product owner. There are basically two aspects to backlog refinement. One is strategic and involves reviewing high-level priorities, objectives, risks, release dates, and options. The other is tactical and involves things such as splitting PBIs so they fit into a sprint, or ensuring the PBIs are ready and the development team has what they need to work on the upcoming items. Also, estimating the size of the work to be done. At the end of the sprint, there are two events that occur sequentially. The first one is called the sprint review, and it is where the product owner and development team will get together with their respective stakeholders and inspect and adapt the product they are building. Scrum talks about the increment, which is the product, deliverable, improvement, or learning the team is reviewing together with the stakeholders. It is the sum of all the PBIs that were finished during the current sprint. If you're a software team, this could be some new functionalities you have added to the product. If you're the HR team in an organization, this might be the first result of the new mentoring program you started piloting. Now, how do we know what was finished? Scrum wants to make sure people don't have to go through the painful experience of asking whether something is done or not, only to hear people say, well, yeah, it's done. I mean, it's not done, but it's basically done. It's fine. Don't worry about it. To which the only natural reaction is to think, I wasn't worried about it before, but now I am. The ambiguity and lack of transparency this generates is a huge risk. So to avoid this, Scrum introduces an artifact called the definition of done, which creates a transparent agreement between the development team and the product owner about what we mean when we say done. It's a checklist that describes internal and external quality standards and expectations. Ideally, when a Scrum team says they are done with an item, it means it could potentially be shipped to the customer or user. The definition of done is a living document, which should be updated as the team improves or learns about new standards or practices they should be following. A Scrum team has one definition of done, and every PBI they work on is ultimately checked against this checklist to see if it is done or not. After the sprint review, the team will move to the last event of the sprint retrospective. This is where the Scrum team inspects and adapts their process, tools, and way of working. The intention in the sprint retrospective is to identify improvement actions or decisions the team can do to continue to improve their ability to deliver value. Decisions are documented in the team's working agreements or definition of done, while improvement actions, resulting from either the sprint review or the sprint retrospective, are added to the product backlog and worked on in subsequent sprints. A healthy Scrum team is pulling into their next sprint at least one improvement action identified during the sprint retrospective. During the sprint retrospective, a team will also review the result of their previous improvement actions or decisions. Did this change actually cause some improvement? Should something else be done about it? After the sprint retrospective, the sprint is over. So what does the Scrum team do? Jump right into the next sprint, which is kicked off by a sprint planning meeting. There is one role we have not mentioned yet in Scrum, and that is the Scrum Master. This person is responsible for making sure all of this works. The Scrum Master is a coach, a facilitator, and an Agile leader. They ensure everyone involved understands what Agile and Scrum are, why successful organizations nowadays work in this way, and, more importantly, that the Scrum team is continuously improving their way of working and their product. They also help to protect the development team from interruptions, while ensuring the organization is creating an environment where trust and collaboration can grow. A good Scrum Master understands the basic building blocks of a great delivery team. That's it. This is Scrum. 3 roles: Product Owner, Development Team, Scrum Master. These 3 roles together are what we refer to as the Scrum team. They self-organize around the product backlog, which is the prioritized list of things to do, answering that key question, what is the next most valuable problem we should be working on? Scrum teams work in sprints, which is Scrum's word for an iteration. It's a time box, the container for everything that happens in Scrum. A sprint starts with a sprint planning, where the development team and product owner agree to which PBIs they will try to deliver the sprint, and what is the development team's plan for doing that, the what and the how. The output of the sprint planning is the sprint backlog, the development team's plan for the sprint. Every day, the Scrum team will have a daily Scrum, where they inspect and adapt their sprint backlog. Are we still on track? Are there any issues we need help on? During the sprint, the Scrum team also needs to do some backlog refinement, which is the activity of looking ahead in the product backlog and making sure the priorities are correct based on the current information they have, and whether the upcoming PBIs are ready to be picked up by the development team. At the end of the sprint, the Scrum team will review their increment together with the respective stakeholders at the sprint review. The increment is the combination of PBIs the team managed to get to done during the sprint. How do they know if a PBI is done? By checking against their definition of done, which is a transparent agreement on everything that should be in place before a PBI can be considered done. After that, the Scrum team will get together in a sprint retrospective to inspect and adapt their way of working and figure out what can they change or work on next sprint to be even better as a team. Any improvement ideas get added back to the product backlog, where they are prioritized. After that, the next sprint starts with a sprint planning. That's it. Rinse and repeat.